What a crazy title for a book, The Insanity of God. Today we get to talk about one of the most transformative books I've read in a long time as we discuss what it means to really follow God into the hard places.
Welcome to the 3D Disciples Podcast, Summer Edition, where we're working together to develop disciples who display God's love as we deploy into God's world. Over the next few months, there'll be one episode dropped here and there. Make sure you're subscribed on whatever platform you listen on so that you know when that episode comes out. We're about done with develop, and then when we come back, we'll be focusing on the next D, which is display. So we plan on the podcast being a little more interview style, a lot more guest, and seeing how we've been doing.
Yeah, well, one of the things you could spend this summer, kind of give a challenge out over the next several months as we kind of look to kicking off in the fall again. Koinonia, being part of a Koinonia cord group. There's special fellowship of Christians that have with one another and an intimate group. Is that these months could be either seeking out or at least praying, Lord, provide me with a group of 2 or 3 people I can join with. That now we have kind of covered the development, a group that I can display the love with and start to help others grow, that we really need one another. And so spend this couple months either seeking or praying that God will provide you with a cord to join for further growth and development.
Today's a book interview. The book is The Insanity of God, a true story of faith resurrected by Nik Ripken. It's a long one.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. There's also the option to listen to it on Audible. Yeah, and probably some other audio
My
platforms.
favorite way to read books now is listen to them.
It was very helpful for me to do a little mixture of the two. So just so you know, for the listeners, there's 2 options there. This was a really great book that you recommended, Jason. So I'm just going to give a quick summary, of it, just so everyone knows kind of what they would be getting into. The first half of the book is Nik Ripken, who is a missionary.
That's a pseudonym, false name.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, that's not his real name.
Oh, okay.
Because of the countries he's worked in, he didn't want people to know his real name, so I don't even know who it really is.
Okay. Well, this missionary is in Somaliland, as he referred to it at the time in the 90s. I think it's called Somali now. And it was very depressing, to be honest, for the first half. The world is not great in Somalia at the time. They're in the middle of a civil war. There's starvation. There's landmines everywhere you walk. It's just kind of a very depressing scene.
Yeah.
It took me some time to get through that. It made me question a lot about things. But then in the second half, the missionary experiences a family loss. The funds get kind of cut to do a lot of the humanitarian relief in Somalia. So he goes through this journey of how can I figure out how to get through how do Christians get through serve God in a persecuted country?
Right.
So he goes to a variety of places, variety of countries, and does all these interviews, which is that's when it gets very inspiring. The stories are just as horrid and just as sad, but the fact that these people continue to glorify God through those processes is just amazing and astounding. So that's kind of the summary, I guess, unless
that's
you want to. Okay. So I was going to tell you, not you, you know it, you read it, but this book presented so many topics that I was bursting to talk about with my family at the dinner table.
Right. And
it led to a lot of hard questions, and a lot of times we were seeking answers to those questions and still didn't come up with an answer.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the way it all started, right? I started reading this thing, and first of all, give credit where credit's due. There's a couple of my elders who presented it to me. They were reading it, and it kind of trickled down to me, and so this was handed down to ended up in my lap eventually. And as you know, after reading it, every week I had to talk about it. I had to talk about something different every week. It's just it will make you burst. It's that kind of book. I can't just
read it and not think about it again.
And contain it. It's just not containable. I have to say something about this. This is eye-opening, life-altering, crazy kind of thoughts.
Yeah, I 100% agree. One of the questions that we were struggling with is if our faith results in the suffering of our family members, our child or our spouse, not just ourselves, like, would we still continue to do that? And I'm like still struggling with that.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you, and you kind of answered, like, did the book force you and those around you to seek answers to hard questions?
Well, it made you face a lot of hard questions, a lot of hard questions, and what you end up doing there is really looking at your faith, like what is my faith is, and how it's easy to say Jesus is worth it when there's no cost, and then but when you start to consider real cost, like, you know, if I follow Jesus or if I worship Jesus, my family can suffer because of my faith. Is Jesus worth that? You know, is that real? Is that what I mean when I say he's worth it, or he's worth it all? And that's a huge challenge. That's where it starts to really get real.
And there was something that Nik, pseudonym, struggled with when he was in Somaliland, was distinguishing between the sin and the sinner. So on page 119, I'm just going to read a quote. He said, "It was easy to put people into categories: good, bad, evil, godly, selfish, giving, ungrateful, kind, hateful. But I saw the lost condition of every human being without the grace of Christ. I had to work hard to remember that neither Islam nor Muslims were the real enemy here. Lostness was the enemy. The enemy was the evil that viciously misleads and traps people into like lost sheep without a shepherd." I feel like I've heard you say something pretty similar.
Yeah. We were coincidentally enough, we had that exact conversation in a Bible study I led earlier today. And we were reading from Romans, where it talks about abhor evil, but then just a few later it talks about bless your enemies and do good to them and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, how do we separate those two things, and how do we deal with people? And it's really hard. The evil is the rejection of Christ. The evil is really the influence of Satan in people's lives. But those people still have value, and how to take people's actions, things they've learned, experienced, you know, they grew up in a Muslim country, or they grew up with no faith, or you know, and they act in those areas, right? So their actions is different than their internal value as a image bearer of God, as someone who Christ loved and died for on the cross, and breaking those things apart and seeing past people's actions and seeing past people's habits and seeing past people's sin to seeing the actual person and the possibilities and of the person past all that. That's really, really, really difficult.
And I can see why he would have had trouble with that, because he was in Somalia for six years. And as an American citizen, I have never seen the things that he was describing in that story. Never.
Yeah, but we have our version of those kind of things. We have our version of things that we find detestable. We find that we would call evil. And really, the conversation we were talking about today is our real enemy is not other people. Our real enemy is Satan. That's our enemy, and that's who we're fighting against. And it's not people, but we make it about people sometimes, and we war against people, and it's a little misplaced.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was even like a conclusion at the end of his book where he was talking about, like, if we want to end persecution, we try to spread democracy, or we try to stand up for human rights. And yes, you can do all of those things, but Christ really thrives in an area where there's persecution.
Yeah.
And you'll learn that if you read the book. Another thing that I wanted to read as a quote was when he sat down with his three boys. They were 11, 13, and 6 years old at the time. And just going to read what he said. So he said, "Boys, when we lived back in America, even before you were born, your mom and I had to answer a very important question. Were we willing to live our lives for Jesus? You know that your mama made that decision as a little girl, and you've heard me tell the story of how I was 18 before I decided that I would follow Jesus and live my life for him. Then, before your mom and I got married, we made certain that we agreed and then we decided that we were willing to live for Jesus together as a couple and a family. Later, when we were thinking about being overseas workers, we had to answer another important question. Were we willing to go with Jesus and live our lives for him in another part of the world? We came to live in Africa after we said yes to that question. Now we've come to live in Kenya so that we can take food and medicine to help and feed to help feed and save the lives of many thousands of people, children, parents, and entire families who live in Somaliland. The reason we do this is to show God's love to the Somali people who have never had a chance to know about Jesus and his love for them. But because these Somalis live in a country that is such a hard and dangerous and bad place right now, your mom and I have to answer another very difficult question. We always have said that we were willing to live for Jesus. Then we decided that we would go with Jesus. We've said yes to both questions, but now we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to die for Jesus? So do you think, Jason, that every believer should have to answer these questions like the live, go, and die?
I think to some extent, yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really do. And I think that the way some people say it, it's impossible to follow Christ, whose ultimate destination was a cross, if you're not willing to follow him to a cross.
Because that's what he tells us to do.
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's, if you're going to follow me, you got to take up your cross. He'll lose his life, will gain it. You have to be there. One thing I can tell you for sure, I think this is 100% sure. If you're going to follow Christ, he's going to lead you in some uncomfortable places. Mm-hmm. And I think the more you follow him, the more uncomfortable it'll get. Mm-hmm. And I think that scares people to death. And we want comfortable Jesus, and that's really not following Jesus. Really not. That's probably one of the big challenges I walked away from this. There's a famous line, I think, in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the Narnia series. Mm-hmm. And when Lucy, the youngest, she's talking to the beavers about Aslan, the lion, this great god, and she goes, "Oh, is he a tame lion?" You know, and the beavers, "Oh no, he's a wild lion." Mm-hmm. And what she's talking about in that scene, I think, is how we see God. We want God to be a tame God. We're fine with him being a lion. Mm-hmm. We just want him to be a tame lion that we can trust, and he's not going to be. There's the wild is removed out of him. Mm-hmm. And the beaver says, "No, he's a wild lion." and it's that if you really follow God, he may ask you to do some wild things. He may take you to some places that are very uncomfortable.
You think that's kind of where the title of the book comes from? Like the insanity of God is in like the insane things that you're going to encounter because of following him.
And I don't know where we're going to end up in this, but I know like my longing after the end of this book is like, that's hard. I want to experience that. Mm-hmm. And the only way I can experience that is to go in these hard places. Mm-hmm. And so Blackaby, in Experiencing God, he says something very similar. You'll never see God work if you don't get in a God-sized hole. Yep. If you don't get you don't get deep enough where all you got's God, don't expect him to show up. Yeah. You know, but man, you start reading some of these stories in here and hearing how God moves and works, and you're like, I want to see that. I want to experience that. I want to go with the wild lion. I'm ready to jump out of the airplane with no chute and say, okay, let's see what happens.
That bursting feeling that you get from this book.
That's I can,
another story that came from the book was that 10,000 Bibles were delivered to a refugee camp that had Somalis in it. The people used, because Somalia is we haven't mentioned this, but is a mostly Muslim country. Yep. Like 99%. Yeah. I'm guessing it's still the same way today.
When he was there, when he first got there was like 150 Christians in the country, and by the time he left, it was down to like 14 or something like that. Yeah, I remember him saying that. Okay. So the Bibles, yes. So at the refugee camp, the people use them to lay in the mud and then use them as sidewalks, and then whatever was left over, they basically used as toilet paper. Right. This story like shocked me, or like just point. Is there a certain story that astounded you the most out of this book? Well, what do you mean by astounded? Like
a fact about like
horrified you? Because that's a horrific one. There's plenty of ones that horrified me.
Yeah, I guess let's go with that, because this is. And we then there's the other topics.
There's inspiring ones too.
Yeah, the inspiring ones we'll get to. Yes, more of the horrific. Yeah, that you just were like shocked by because we're not on that side of the world.
Well, there's a story in there that the probably the most horrific story that he tells in there is that he goes into, and I don't remember where this was at, but he goes, and it may have been in Somaliland, but he goes into a hospital, and there's a 13-year-old girl, emaciated from starvation. She weighed like 18 pounds or something like that. She's 13 years old, and like the nurse, who's the only trained person, is in this bombed out hospital, and she's caring for the people the best she can. And he walks over to the girl and he rubs her cheek with his finger, and she smiles at him. And it really moved his heart that she smiled. And they went on the rest of the tour of the hospital, and a half hour later when they came back, she had passed away. And in that moment, and just that scene, that's the kind of devastation of humanity that's out there. We live so insulated, especially in America. We live so insulated from what probably 3/4 of the world, if not more of the world, really lives like. I mean, those are some extreme examples, but it's not far off in a lot of countries.
Yeah. So there was another point in the story where he was giving out meds and food to everyone that was like waiting in a very long line. They had to wait in line for hours, and he would do this day in and day out. He would have guards that protected him, and they had to meet early in the morning so that it wouldn't get the humanitarian relief wouldn't get stolen. At one point, though, he finally decided that he would talk to the people in the line, and there was a really interesting thing that happened during that occurrence. So he was talking to a woman, and she was telling her story about everything that she had been through. And I'll just read this quote here. He was amazed to see the power of human presence. In my pride, I thought I knew exactly what these people needed, but I never would have thought to put conversation or human connection on my list. I was profoundly humbled. There was much more to these suffering Somalis than their overwhelming physical needs. Their stories convinced me that it would never be enough to merely feed and shelter them. We do that much for the animals. That quote kind of reminds me of like some of the stories you and Scott shared about your mission trip in Philly. And so how do we see Jesus use human connection over just simply meeting people's needs?
I think that is so huge in the ministry of Jesus. I mean, you think about, he sits down with the woman at the well, and they have this whole long conversation, and it's not like he's like, hey, guess what? I'm Messiah. That's what, it's just, it's in the middle of a conversation that he just had, like, Zacchaeus, come down. I'm going to have supper at your house tonight. We're going to spend some time together, and it's in those relating moments. And so that's why we always talk about this being a relationship. And as we start talking about the next D here at the church, the display, I mean, that is the key, as we start to deal with people, is to not just, because we can make ministry about, oh, you need food, you need clothing, you need whatever. Let me get that to you. And we like give it to them, pat them on the back. Ta-da, we have done ministry. And it, and I think the real gift of ministry is, in that situation, it's that human contact. It's, you matter enough for me to sit and listen to you tell me what's going on in your life. And he finds out that ministered to him twice as much as giving them food. That was kind of food for the soul. And that's just so easy to do. And we overlook the power of human connection and giving these people just caring about their story, caring about what they've been through, just listening and not answering, not directing, not counseling. This doesn't need to be a counseling session. This needs to be a caring session. And that's probably we could use that ministry everywhere right now. And it could change people's lives.
It's crazy that took him that long to figure that out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I identify with him. It's taken me a long time to figure things out too sometimes.
All right. So moving away from what was happening in Somalia, another country he went to was Russia.
Right.
And so one of the things I found was really interesting is that a lot of the sermon topics actually had to be approved by the communist leaders. And also the pastors had to probably make some compromises to stay in their pastor position, or otherwise they were removed.
Absolutely.
So could you imagine if this was your world?
Yeah. I'm non-conformist enough that would be big trouble for me.
Yeah.
Like, people started coming in like, you can't say this and you got to say that, and you can't bring this subject up, and here's what you're going to do. I'd be like, yeah, I'd be in trouble pretty quick.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you would. All right. So also what happened in Russia is Nik met this man who told him that persecution is like sun rising in the east. It's nothing unusual. It's just normal and ordinary. So Nik, before hearing that and before all of his interviews, kind of felt that persecution was something to avoid, like a setback, a barrier, as he described it. But after all his research, he began to think that maybe persecution is in fact the soil in which faith can grow. I'm still trying to convince myself of that. That persecution is the kind of soil I want to be planted in. But I learned a lot of benefits about that from this book. And I feel so much more prepared for persecution because of the manual, to be honest. Because it teaches you, like, there were stories about how they had to forgive people who were smearing human feces on their toast before they ate in the morning.
Right.
Like, and we had a whole subject about forgiveness and how you, when you're in prison, you stay connected with God by fellowship with others. I think the manual really does help prepare for that. I don't know if that was your intention with the manual at all, but
I question what my intentions were sometimes. We've gone, you were just kind of talking about this before we started recording. Like, this has been a year. We've been into this a year now. And where we are and where we seem to be going, I didn't plan any of this. I mean, this was, I had just followed one step at a time like everybody else, I think. And I'm amazed at the journey that we've gotten on. We called this a journey at the beginning, and it's been a journey for all of us. And even like the books we've talked about that introduced, I see God's hand in all this. Like this book is coming up just as we're starting to talk about display and deploy. The coincidences are just too coincidental to be coincidences. It's just too much. And I just see God's hand all over this. And that's why I got so excited by this book. Like, you don't just start reading this at this moment when we're starting to take the next steps in our discipleship journey and be challenged by this. Like, I have to
about
tell
to live, go, and die, basically. Display, deploy, like, get your boots on.
Are you going to tell the story about the guy in Siberia who's
No, go ahead.
There's so many. I mean,
there really are.
There's so many.
Have pages. I'm sure. I don't know if we're going to break this into two parts.
So the one that, like, there's so many moments that he has that you just like stab you. But there's one. So it's a deacon of a church who is woke up in the middle of the night by the Holy Spirit. And the pastor had been sent to prison before preaching in a church. This was in Russian Siberia. And his wife and kids had been shipped off to Siberia, and they were living in this little shack hut somewhere in Siberia. So, again, the family suffering because of him, right? And trying to put pressure on him to deny his faith and all that kind of stuff. And so this deacon's woke up in the middle of the night, and the Spirit tells him, I want you to saddle your horse and grab all this food and take it to the widow, or take it to the wife and her children, because they're about to starve to death. And the guy's having this whole argument with the Holy Spirit, and he's like, yeah, but it's the middle of the night. And like, yeah, I know. And he's like, well, yeah, but it's like it's negative 32 degrees outside, and there's wolves around, and if I go, like, the wolves might attack me and kill my horse and whatever. And he goes, and he's like, I might not be able to come back. And the Spirit, he said, he very clearly heard the Spirit say, I don't need you to come back. I need you to go. And I'm just sitting there like, I mean, chills run up my spine just now talking about that, because it's like, we want to barter with God. Like, I'm willing to go if you will guarantee, one, my success, that what I'm sent to do will succeed, and two, I get to return, and things are going to be okay. And we want all these guarantees for God and kind of barter with him. Like, I'll do anything you say as long as I'm successful, protected, and safe, and those just, you can't launch out with those kind of parameters.
Yeah.
You just need to go, and it doesn't really, it doesn't even matter if you go back, you get to return or not. I'm sending you to go do this. And
I can't think of one person in a story where they had those parameters given to them. They
they
didn't know what was going to happen.
And I'm just like, I think about that phrase where Jesus talks to the disciples, he gets in the boat, and they're terrified because of the storm, and he goes, ye of little faith. And I'm just so challenged by what we got to what's ahead of us, and we just got to be able to just, hey, I'll just go and not worry about, and let the rest fall where it is.
Another quote would be from another Russian man. I think his name was Stoyan. We're going to go over time. It's just going to be what's going to be. Or we'll break it into two parts. He said, I took great joy that I was suffering in my country so that you could be free to witness in your country. Don't ever give up in freedom what we would never have given up in persecution. That quote haunts me, like literally every day.
Yet another one.
It haunts me because of my choice to be silent. Like, I'm sitting at the dinner table with extended friends and family, and I'm nervous to pray because I don't want to make them uncomfortable. I think it would be inconvenient. And I have the freedom to do so, and I still choose not to. So what changed for you after reading this book? Because that's one that every day just runs through my mind.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make it even worse for you.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So this is his first book. The next book is called The Insanity of Obedience. And in that book, he starts to talk about persecution. And the goal of persecution is to silence the witness of Christ. It's not really persecution is not designed to kill Christians. It's not really designed to get Christians to recant their faith. That's not their ultimate goal. The real goal of persecution is to get Christians just to be silent, so that they stop talking about Christ. And he goes, we in America, we identify more with persecutors than we would do the persecuted, because we willingly keep silent. The reason we're not in persecution is they don't need to make us shut up, because we've already willingly shut up.
He does say that at the
is that in this book too?
He says it at the end.
And you put that with, we've given up in our freedom what they would never give up in their persecution, and that we actually align more with persecutors than with the persecuted. Yeah, if that don't keep you up awake at night, and like I am silent, and I could. We brag about our freedom and our freedom of speech, and we use it so little. Yeah,
we really do. I agree. One of the things that you can face in persecution, or at least the people in China did, was another quote I'm just going to read. Virtually every believer who I met in China had either been to prison for their faith, or they knew someone who had. And they had come out of it with a deeper spiritual roots, a more mature faith, and a greater appreciation for fellowship with believers. So going back to the idea of what happens in America versus other places where they're persecuted, in China, right around the time World War II ended, there were like about hundreds of thousands of believers in Christ. By 1998, after 50 years of government opposition, there were hundreds of millions of believers in China. So
exponential growth.
Yeah. So what could the freedoms we have in America be stalling that growth?
Oh, I think they are.
Yeah, because we're not being challenged.
Well, I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I think he coined this term in late World War II. He's like, a faith that costs nothing is worth nothing. And so we see in these countries where there's a real high cost to pay, their faith is worth so much more to them because they actually pay something for it. And when your faith is worth nothing, it's nothing. And so faith that costs nothing is worth nothing.
Yeah, I can agree that.
Something to that effect anyway.
I'm sorry, I have to read another quote. This is related to that too, about a woman who says, okay, so they met a woman who had to flee her country because of her belief, and she was in a mainly Islamic country. Then she joined the United Nations and was helping serve women who were injured or hurt by the Taliban. So, and then eventually she just had to come to America because she was so unsafe where she was. So she got to witness a baptism in Kentucky, and this was her reaction. She said, I cannot believe this. I can't believe that I have lived long enough to see people being baptized in public. An entire family together. No one is shooting at them. No one is threatening them. No one will go to prison. No one will be tortured, and no one will be killed. And they're being openly and freely baptized as a family. I never dreamed that God could do such things. I never believed that I would live to see a miracle like this. Why aren't all these people standing and cheering and clapping at such a miracle from God? I think I'm going to burst with joy.
Yeah. So the rest of that scene is everybody's sitting quietly in their pew watching this baptism take place, and they're not just all freaking out about it. And I remember she's like about to she's
jump
fidgeting.
out of her skin.
She's about to
yeah. Just like and these are the things that you encounter over and over again in this book. It's just like you never thought that would be a miracle. At least maybe some people did, but to hear her think that way and to understand what could have happened to her if she would have done that in public, it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, and it's probably good to point out, because it's going to sound, I probably threw this little vignette in there. It sounds like and maybe this book is pretty down on America. It certainly challenges us open and honestly about some of our failings, but I think that's actually in a section where he's talking about the miracle of America. Like we miss this miracle that God has done here in our country. Like we can openly baptize and people aren't died. We can openly share that these are miracles that the rest of the world looks at us as miraculous, and because we sit in it sometimes, we maybe miss the miracle, but it doesn't mean the miracle has not happened. That God has really done some miraculous work in our country, and it's a good challenge for us to appreciate that a little bit in that thing. And it's not just all the missteps we make, but just that was
another thing I was going to bring up is like I just take for granted that I can say out loud Jesus is Lord without persecution for it.
Right.
Whereas there's some stories in here where you definitely cannot.
I really love the Chinese one where it talks about he's at a conference and he's interviewing some people, and some of the leaders say, "Oh, they're immature yet." He's like, "They haven't even been to prison yet."
Yeah.
But, it's like they're okay. They got a lot of growing to do, and it's like they haven't even had their chance to go to prison yet. They're like that's their seminary.
Yeah.
Like going to prison is their seminary. And he's like they're good kids and they're trying to do okay, but they're not. We're not even, and I think they even said they're not even sure they're Christians yet because they haven't gone to prison yet. Once they go to prison and come back, now we're sure they're actual believers and they really mean what they say. And now they're starting to get it.
Another thing that they had brought up too in China that blew my mind was they asked the missionary. They were like, "Are there other believers around the world? Like, is Jesus only known in China?" And I'm like, "What?
Yeah,
they don't know that there's. They think Jesus is only anyways." Okay. Okay. So Nick wanted to hear all these stories. It was his main goal. He just interviews people, trying to understand how to bring Jesus into these persecuted countries. So he was in Russia, and his old pastor came up to him after he asked, like, "Why don't you want to tell your stories? Like, why aren't these written down? Why aren't you sharing them?" So I'll just read a quote again because I can't say it better than he did. So the old pastor said to him, "Son, when did you stop reading your Bible? All of our stories are in the Bible. God has already written them down. Why would we bother writing books to tell our stories when God already has told his story? If you just read your Bible, you would see that our stories are there." Just another one.
Yeah, that's probably my main takeaway from this. I think this is the conclusion, one of the main conclusions from the book. I think I've said I've had 5 main takeaways now. So every takeaway is a main takeaway.
Yeah.
But what really I want to continue to look for is the conclusion he reaches is that we sometimes read the Bible as a history book. Like this is a history of the actions of God. This is stuff God did in the past. And he draws this conclusion, no, this is the way God is now. And he still works very similar to the way he worked in the Bible in the world today. Now, we may not see that here and in our context, but there's places around the world that all the stories we read about God in the Bible, they're still happening in very, very similar ways. There was a story in the Bible where a guy's told to go find a certain man, right? Ananias is told that Paul's going to come. Well, there's a story in this Bible. He's like, tells this guy, go to this street, go up this street, find this door, knock on the door and tell him, I'm here to find Jesus.
Yeah. Well, what about the story when he flies to Central Asia and there's 5 guys there waiting for him, all from different parts of the country, hundreds of miles away, being like, we were told we were going to meet somebody who's going to teach us about Christ here.
Yeah.
Through our dreams.
Are you the guy that we've been waiting for? Yeah. The dreams. There are people having dreams and some visions that God's telling. He's doing miraculous, people getting freed from prison when they were off to be beheaded, when they were off to be killed. Well, that's, we read those stories in the Old Testament. Joseph, on the way, you're in prison, you're going to be beheaded, and then all of a sudden you're free, or like in the lion's den. Now, those moments are still happening around the world. And it's like, the Bible is not just a history book of the action of God. It's a manual describing the actions of God presently. And that's kind of what that guy's saying. And that's kind of the conclusion. And that's where I kind of like, all right, that is the way God works. I want to see some of that. I want to experience that. This is what God wants for us to have. And the only reason we don't do it is we just hold back, I think. We want to be like Lucian. Is he a tame lion? I'm good with the tame lion. He's a wild lion. That's a little scary.
So yeah, the insanity of God, if you want to be challenged.
And trust us, there is much, much more. We have covered, it sounds like we've covered a lot. We are just scratching the surface of what's really housed within this book. Read it and come talk to us. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Our prayer is that you've heard something today that will help you be a better disciple of Jesus Christ. We also want to encourage you to make sure you take your next step in your discipleship journey by considering what it is you would do about what you heard today, and then go and do it. Finally, we want to invite you to join us at 10:30 on Sundays, either at our Main Street campus in downtown Clarion between Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's, or online at fbcclarion.com. God bless.